in every tradition, in every healing tradition, stories and narratives are very important. And they tell us so much about human beings, you know?
Gabor, thank you for being here today. Of course, your extensive body of work is a testament to your intellectual prowess and deep-rooted compassion. But what continues to strike me is your indefatigable spirit. And I'm told that your next book with your son Daniel is on its way.
Yeah.
So I want to start by diving into your book, The Myth of Normal. And as you can see, I've got sticky notes all over because I loved reading it. I was particularly struck by your exploration of interbeing, a concept resonating with Eastern philosophies of non-dualism. In Hindi, we describe this web of existence as jal. And as a native of India, these kind of ideologies were a part of my childhood. I find it fascinating that for a physician trained in the West, in the organ system approach, you speak so strongly against this dualism and instead emphasize a more holistic way of looking at a patient. How did this belief evolve for you, and was there a particular significant source of inspiration?
You know, what is frustrating about this topic is that Western practice is completely devoid or divorced from Western science. Because from the scientific point of view, the interbeing, the interconnections, what our colleague Dan Siegel, who's going to be at the conference, calls interpersonal neurobiology, and what I call interpersonal biology, is just how it is, so that people's emotional dynamics affect their physiology. And since our emotional dynamics are so determined by our relationships, what else is there except interbeing, not to mention our connections to the natural environment and so on. So there's nothing new about this. Traditional healing practices from India to indigenous North America have always understood this. Western science has more than proved it and overproved it, and yet Western medical practice completely ignores it. So as to how I came to it is because as a family physician, I couldn't help noticing that the people that got sick in my practice, that illness had everything to do with their lives, with their traumas, with their relationships, with how they felt about themselves, with how they related to their work, with the stresses in their lives. So it just became obvious to me. What I didn't realize is that there was all this science. So once I began to put together my own observations with this vast trove of Western science, it was not even a question anymore. It was only afterwards that I also found out about the traditional and Eastern ways of understanding, and it all fit together. And what is miraculous, I should say, anti-miraculous, is not that we should understand interbeing, which is a phrase of the great Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh.
Yeah.
But the Buddha talked about, and the Hindu rishis talked about this thousands of years ago. What is miraculous, if I can put it that way, is that we in the West don't get it, despite all the science. So it's a weird situation. And by the way, weird means there's a kind of a bias in the West.
That's so interesting because I've grown up with having symbols like Rangoli is an art form where we have or the Celtic knot, or you have the mandala. All of these we've grown up with. So it's exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, and of course, this is not a theoretical conversation, because it is real practical implication for people's lives and people's health. And over again, I find that people who, because of their illness, start questioning their whole lives, the illness comes along almost like a teacher. Not that I recommend it to anybody, but they learn about their true selves and how separate they're from their true selves, and how healing has to do with reconnection and understanding their place in the universe, And so a lot of people they come to this wisdom through illness, unfortunately. And it's also the case that a lot of healing can happen when people began to understand the interconnections. And so that it's not just a theoretical philosophical question, it's a very practical question of how do people heal.
I think it's really interesting that you say that, because that brings me on to my next question. I live in India, and however stereotypical it may be to associate India with gurus and spirituality, it is true that gurus promising all manner of healing and salvation really do abound here. They seem to have a solution for everything. Now, while I acknowledge the value and efficaciousness that spiritual traditions may have for some, as a clinical psychologist and a researcher, I've always been sort of on the fence about it, preferring to put my belief in doctors and meta analysis. That was until I had several near death bouts of asthma or asthma, as you say in the West. Unfortunately, medical science gave me only symptomatic relief, and that too through a life sentence of steroid dependence. And so I began to look more seriously at alternative approaches, finding myself at a naturopathy center. And I've read about you, and I know that you know about naturopathy, and studying yoga with Raya, an eminent guru at the Iyengar Institute here in Pune. Since I discontinued that training during the lockdown almost 3 years now, I'm happy to say that I have been inhaler free, which I think shouldn't be the case.
Sorry to interrupt, but asthma is such an interesting example for two reasons. One is it's one of the conditions on which there have been research for decades about the relationship of stress and asthma. And children whose parents are stressed are much more likely to have asthma. In fact, the more stressed the parents are, the more medication the child has to take, according to some studies.
Yeah.
Number one. Number two, here in North America, it's been shown that the more episodes of racism a Black woman experiences, the greater her risk for asthma. So that's the one side of it. There's all this research for decades. The other thing is, how do we treat asthma? With inhalers. What's in inhalers? Cortisol and adrenaline, or copies of it. What are cortisol and adrenaline? They're stress hormones manufactured by our adrenal glands. So here we're treating this condition with stress hormones, and we never ask ourselves, gosh, maybe is there a connection between stress and this condition? Sure, there is. What happens is that over chronic stress, the body's own stress response mechanism becomes inefficient and depleted. And now we have to give extra stress hormones. Yeah. And so if you look at all these conditions of inflammation, in the case of asthma, it's in the lungs. In the case of skin, psoriasis, eczema. In the case of the guts, it's colitis, Crohn's disease. In the case of the nervous system, it's multiple sclerosis. I could go on. We give stress hormones for everything. And we never ask ourselves, oh, gee, does stress maybe have something to do with this? And of course, stress has to do with the mind-body unity that we've been talking about and relationships, And so the links are obvious.
It's so interesting to hear you, because so many times I second guess myself. I feel that maybe my getting better was all just a coincidence. Although, on the other hand, I cannot deny my own experience. Similarly, there have been some critics of your work who suggest that the healing stories you discuss, say, of spontaneous cancer remission as a result of a trauma healing narrative, sound too good to be true and rely on anecdotes. How would you respond to this critique?
Okay, nonsense. Okay, first of all, just nonsense. That's the first point. The second point is these are not spontaneous healing. There's nothing spontaneous about them. If you study them, there's a certain pattern. That's the second point. The third point is it has been studied. There's been documented cases, in fact, published in a couple of books I could mention, of people that have so-called spontaneous remission, where people have been told they're going to die, and years later they're alive. And these are not anecdotes. Their cases are documented. They've been published. And, and what happens is, in every case, there's a real change in life. People change their diet. People, they start to meditate. They start relating to nature differently. But the biggest difference is they start relating to themselves differently. They have a complete transformation of how they relate to themselves and their view of themselves. And they take agency over their lives. This has been documented. So those people say it's not documented. They're just ignorant of the evidence. And their ignorance is not individual. It's not like their fault. It has to do with the ideology of medical practice, which doesn't look at what it doesn't understand, and so it's not true that it hasn't been documented. It's just not true. And by the way, when it comes to anecdotes, you know what? I believe in anecdotes. I think human stories, this argument that it's anecdotal, so what? The fact is that people store in every tradition, in every healing tradition, stories and narratives are very important, and they tell us so much about human beings. And the this narrow Western idea of medicine or evidence is so restricted. It leaves out so much of human experience. So even if it was only anecdotal, I'd say good. At least be open to understanding it. But it's not just anecdotal. So that argument is just spurious. It's false. It's off the mark entirely.
I really loved what you said about anecdotes because my grandmother believed in stories and told me many. I loved her greatly. She lived until the age of 93. She lost her eyesight at the age of 90. And one of the things that she told me was, I might have lost my sight, but I gained vision. And that stayed with me. But you see, it was anecdotal. And when you say story, a lot of who I am today has a lot to do with stories and less to do with data that I've read about. Which brings me to my last question. In your book, you speak about small t trauma, which is a less memorable but hurtful and far more prevalent misfortunes of childhood. This could be a harsh comment from a parent or a friend, not being seen or accepted in school, and so on. And the considerable impact of this trauma on how some of us might respond to things in our today and tomorrow. So the assumption that this internal pain to the seemingly small external event be labeled as trauma runs a bit contrary to some Indian cultural beliefs that emphasize the educational importance of adversity, especially in childhood. It's a belief that is encapsulated in proverbs such as the lotus blooms most beautifully from the deepest and thickest mud, or to harvest the benefits of the Ayurvedic neem leaf, one must first endure its bitterness and especially stop complaining. So I was brought up in this way, and when I studied with Albert Ellis in New York, I was not surprised by his metaphorical thumb sucking technique, pushing clients to stop dwelling on their past and bemoaning life's unfairness. Now, I understand that this can be problematic for some clients, but how does one synthesize these seemingly opposite perspectives, and how can we distinguish between the misuse of traumatic narratives, at least the small t trauma, for attention or secondary gain, versus those authentically grappling with profound pain from their past?
So trauma just means a wound, okay? Now, Radhika, you said you're married, right?
Yes.
Does it ever happen in your relationship that you perceive that your husband doesn't understand you sometimes emotionally? Does it ever happen?
Every day. We've known each other for 23 years.
Well, how does it feel to you when it happens?
I feel upset.
Okay. And here you're an adult.
Yes, I'm an adult.
And you're quite free and you're not dependent on your husband.
No, I'm not dependent on my husband, not at all. Maybe a little.
Now, imagine what if you're 2 years old and you're not understood by the people on whom your life depends? Can you see how wounding that would be?
Yes.
So that's what I mean by the small t trauma. If we as adults can feel hurt when our partners don't understand us, imagine how hurt the small child feels who's totally dependent. And that's what I mean by the small t trauma. It happens every day and it has an impact. As a matter of fact, the reason your husband not understanding you hurts you today is because it triggers the wound of not having been understood as a child. Okay. That's the first point. The second point is that when you talk about adversity, it's true that children have to learn to deal with adversity, but that doesn't mean we have to impose adversity on them. That's cruel. Life will bring its own adversities. You know why? Because your cat will be killed by a car outside your house, because your grandfather will die, because your friends won't want to play with you, because your toy breaks. I mean, life brings its own hurts and disappointments. The natural response in our brains, we are wired for certain emotions: grief and fear and panic and anger and love and playfulness and curiosity and so on. There's a reason why our brains are wired for this, because they're part of the fullness of life. When a child is grieving, to tell them, just get over it, is to make sure that they won't get over it. When a child is grieving because their cat died or they lost their favorite doll or whatever it is, you say, oh, you're feeling really sad. You're feeling really sad right now. Then a child will learn that the sadness will come, it'll go, they can handle it. So, in order to help children deal with adversity, we don't want to impose adversity on them, and we don't dismiss, we don't denigrate, we don't diminish their emotions, we validate them. And that's how a child learns to deal with adversity. As when it comes to adults and therapy, it's not a question of whining about the past. That's not useful. You know, the stuff that happened to me when I was a year old, 78 years ago, that happened. It's never not going to have happened. But how it shows up today in my life, that matters. So it's not a question of talking about the past as a way of whining about it. It's a question of understanding how is the past affecting my present. Now, I would say, I don't know you personally. This is the first time we've ever met. I hope when you're in Vancouver, we'll have a chance to hang around a bit more. But I would say your asthma has everything to do with a training that forced you to suppress your emotions and not to be in touch with yourself, you know? And it's not surprising to me that if you connect with your body and you do yoga and whatever, your asthma will get better, you know? So I think that this idea that children should just get over it or that adults shouldn't talk about the past, it's completely wrong-headed. We talk about the past not to dwell on it, not to make ourselves victims of it, but so we can learn from it and we can recognize how the imprints of the past show up in the present so that we can actually take responsibility and get past it. So that's the point.
I think that's a wonderful way of wording it when you use the word imprints. And after having read your book, now I became very curious about what happened after the end. I know that you have been in the pursuit of some insights. Has that happened? Where are you at now?
Well, I often talk about my epitaph, you know, the engraving on my tombstone. You know what it's going to say? It's going to say, it was a lot more work than I had anticipated.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Because you know what? As long as, you know, maybe once I become a Buddha, you know, or a really enlightened rishi, and I don't expect to get there, you know, then I can say, oh, now I know everything, you know, but I'm not there yet. Life is continually unfolding. I continue to come up against the imprints of the past, and I continue to learn from them, you know. And there's such a phrase as growing older. Now, what does it mean, growing older? It doesn't mean it could say getting older, and getting older is just aging. But what does it mean, growing older? It means you can actually grow as you get older. Like your grandmother said, she lost her sight and she gained vision, and that's a process that goes on. So yeah, I'm still having to deal with sometimes with the imprints of the past, and the task is to come into the present. And I think that's for most of us. I think that's a lifelong process.
Then I must tell you a story that was told to me by my grandmother. There was a guru and a disciple glowing with a kind of sincerity that could put 1,000 suns to shame, approached her with a query. He said, what penance, what rigorous study must I undertake, and how long will I have to dance in the shadows before I can bask in this light of enlightenment? And now the Guru, her eyes reflecting the wisdom of the ages, like yourself, replied, a span of maybe a decade, my dear. This disciples got upset and recoiled and uh, gasped, escaping his lips, said, a decade? That's a lifetime. I mean, what if I pour myself into the studies, I forsake my sleep, I turn away from all worldly pursuits, and I dedicate every waking moment to my quest for enlightenment? How long then? And this guru, with an enigmatic smile playing on her lips, said, well, in that case, my dear, it's going to take you twice the amount of time. You know.